Hi guys, this is Erica from Gokce Capital. Now before I begin, be sure to click subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Paul Crawford, the Brooklyn-born crack detective, had been called to Nye County to solve a brutal murder in Nevada's Death Valley National Park. Crawford was an old hand, previously leading the investigation into the murder of Ranger Margaret Anderson in Mount Rainier National Park. Now, on an early May day, Crawford was in Nye County, surveying the skid marks at his latest crime scene and collecting video evidence alongside two Nye County detectives. The victim in this case was not another ranger, nor a park visitor, but a small, bright blue fish floating almost serenely in the crystal waters of a small oasis. But more on the Devil's Hole Pupfish murder later. For first, if you are looking at developing rural land, or simply love the natural environment, you should be familiar with the Endangered Species Act. So in today's video, we're going to cover the top things you should know about this law and how it may impact you as a landowner or nature lover. Number 1. The Endangered Species Act aims to provide a framework to conserve and protect endangered and threatened plants and animals and their habitats. The act was passed in 1973 and has since been the nation's most effective law at protecting at-risk species from extinction. Number 2. The lead agencies charged with implementing the act are the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Fisheries Service. As a landowner, you will most likely interact with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, for they are the ones in charge of all land and freshwater species. The law requires that the lead agency consult with other federal, local, state, and tribal officials to ensure that the actions they authorize are carried out. Number 3. The Endangered Species Act allows individuals and organizations to petition to have species listed as either endangered or threatened. Once a petition has reached the agency, it will undergo rigorous scientific evaluation and public review to determine whether the species should be listed. If the species does end up being listed, the Endangered Species Act then requires protection for critical habitat areas, as well as the development and implementation of recovery plans to help preserve the species. To undertake the protection of habitat and implementation of the recovery plan, the lead federal agency will need to coordinate with other federal agencies as well as state, tribal, and local officials to ensure all necessary actions are undertaken to prevent extinction. If the agencies are successful and a species is considered recovered, it can then be removed from the list, and more on that later. Number 4. In its nearly 50 years of existence, the Endangered Species Act has been very successful. In its first 40 years, the Act prevented the extinction of 99% of the species under its protection. It has designated millions of acres as critical habitat, and has helped at least 46 species recover, including such iconic animals as the grizzly bear, humpback whale, and bald eagle. And despite the fact that the act is often highlighted in intense political or land use debates, polls show that it has strong public support overall. Number 5. Once a species is listed, there will be a number of actions that are prohibited. These actions involve anything that may harm the species or damage its critical habitat. What this means for a landowner is that if there is an endangered species on your property, you will often be prohibited from undertaking certain actions, such as cutting trees or developing the property. Having said this, though, property owners can apply for an incidental take permit from the lead agency, again usually the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, to take a listed species. When you apply for a permit, you will generally need to create a habitat conservation plan, which is designed to reconcile your proposed land use or development with species conservation. So the permit is not giving you a blank slate. You will still need to show that you are doing everything in your power to help preserve the species and its habitat. There are also certain circumstances where a landowner may voluntarily agree to manage their lands for the benefit of a candidate species in exchange for being exempt from future land use regulations. One example of this is a conservation agreement with assurances. Now, this agreement comes into play before a species is listed, when a landowner voluntarily manages their land for the benefit of a species that is a candidate to be listed but is not currently listed. Here's one recent example of how a conservation agreement with assurances work. In this case, there is a rare butterfly being listed as an endangered species. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services invited landowners to participate in a candidate conservation agreement with assurances. The conservation measures involved limiting disturbance to habitat patches, protecting patches through fencing, and allowing deer hunting to limit deer consumption of the butterfly's preferred plants. Voluntarily participating in the agreement would provide protections against future regulations once the species was listed, and would provide landowners with protection from liability if they inadvertently killed or injured one of the butterflies. Number 6. To delist a species, the following factors must be considered: whether previous threats have been eliminated or controlled, how much the population has grown since the species was listed, and the stability of habitat quality and quantity. In addition, there is also the practice of downlisting a species, where it may not be delisted but reclassified from endangered to threatened because certain threats have been controlled. But let's return to the Devil's Hole pupfish murder. On May 2nd in 2016, biologist Kevin Wilson arrived for work in the National Park Service outpost in Pahrump, Nevada. There was bad news waiting for him. Playing on his computer screen was surveillance footage from the night before, showing an ATV pull up next to the fence surrounding the Devil's Hole hot spring. He watched as 3 drunken men attempt, fail, and then succeed at climbing the fence surrounding the hot spring. Once inside, one of the men jumped into the hot spring, barreling through the sole breeding ground of the Devil's Hole pupfish. When Wilson went to investigate Devil's Hole, he found one bright blue pupfish floating dead on the spring's surface. Situated in one of the most inhospitable climates in the continental U.S., this spring is part of an ancient network of hot springs fed by an underground aquifer that carves its way through limestone caverns deep beneath the Gokce Desert. Devil's Hole itself is small at the surface, just 11.5 feet wide, but incredibly deep, so deep that earthquakes on the other side of the world cause its waters to shake. The pool's narrow opening only allows 4 hours of sunlight to reach the water's surface, just enough time for algae to grow on a small, shallow, 11 by 16 foot shelf where the Devil's Hole pupfish has lived for thousands of years, completely isolated from nearly all other life. And today, there are just 170 individuals in existence, continuing to survive in this minuscule habitat, the smallest of any known vertebrate species. When the drunken interlopers killed a pupfish on that May evening, they killed just under 1% of a species heavily protected by the Endangered Species Act, which was why Detective Crawford was called in to track down the perpetrators. Fortunately for Detective Crawford, one of the sergeants in the Nye County Police Department was a bit of an off-road enthusiast and was able to find the vehicle, which had been listed for sale the day before the break-in. At first, Detective Crawford was worried the prime suspect would get a tip-off from his friends and run, but he turned out to be very cooperative. He was extremely polite and volunteered that he was already a convicted felon, having been convicted of grand theft in San Bernardino, California, while he was struggling with addiction. He later turned himself in, telling the judge, "I'm not one to make excuses for what I have done wrong. I made a stupid mistake and I take full responsibility." His sentence was 12 months in prison, along with a fine. So if you think that the Endangered Species Act is something that you can ignore, this story is a great example of why you should be careful, for the penalties can be severe. But if you were thinking that there was an uproar over the harsh penalty, you would be surprised. Neither the man nor his family were angry, just sad about the whole affair. And perhaps this is because, once you set aside politics, most Americans, whether hunters, fishers, ranchers, or conservationists, love our country's landscape and the animals that inhabit it. Despite the occasional loud fight over water use or land rights, I think most of us agree with the primary aim of the Endangered Species Act and want to ensure that we don't lose our rich natural heritage. And for the pupfish, the protections put in place for its habitat have been responsible for protecting the entire Amargosa Valley and its network of iconic hot springs. But do you have any stories about the Endangered Species Act? Let us know in the comments. Did you like this video? You're going to love our Gokce Land Due Diligence program. We'll make you a land due diligence expert in just 7 days. Check it out at gokcecapital.com/glad. And while you're at our website, don't forget to explore our $1 down listings at gokcecapital.com/listings. Finally, don't hesitate to reach out. You can email, call, or text, and we will respond as soon as possible. So thank you for listening, and more to come.